in terms of the kind of question of data ethics and making it real. So I want to talk a little bit about what making it real means, and I want to talk a little bit about real for whom. And when we think about for whom we are trying to make data ethics real, how that reveals different questions that we want to ask and different questions that we want to answer. When I first started thinking about data ethics, I was trying to kind of make sense of the problems that people were bringing to the Ethics Centre, because all these people were starting to come to us and say, we need your help, we need your advice, we're thinking of implementing AI in this particular capacity, we don't really know how, we don't really know what we're trying to do, or we have all this data, we're sitting on all this data and there's all this stuff that we can do, but we're not sure what the limits and stuff are. And I kept coming back to a quote from Alice in Wonderland. Anyone familiar? Who's familiar with Alice in Wonderland? Phyllis Carroll. Yeah. So Alice is walking down the path, and on a branch above her, she sees the Cheshire Cat. And she says to the cat, would you please tell me which way I should go? And the cat says, well, that depends a good deal on where you want to get to. And she said, it doesn't much matter where I get to. And he says, well, then you can go wherever you want. And that reminds me so much of the kinds of people who are coming to us and trying to talk through data ethics problems. They know that they've got all this data, and they know they want to do something with it because everyone's doing something with data, but they don't really know what they want to do, and they don't really know how they want to do it. How many people are familiar with that kind of problem? Okay, yeah, lots of people, lots of hands, lots of relatability. Excellent. So there's a few ways that you can give them a direction on where they want to go. You can give them some orientation in terms of what is going to maximise their organisational or their personal self-interest. What's going to make you the most money? What's going to give you the biggest share of the marketplace? It's going to amplify your power in a particular way. You can give them an answer in terms of what everyone else is doing. Go the same way that everybody else is. Take the road more travelled by, and that will make all the difference. What we encourage them to do is to make that choice around where they want to get to and how they want to get there, based on something that is a little bit more meaningful, that takes into account a few more stakeholders and has a slightly longer history, and that's to think about things in terms of ethics. So, quick primer on what ethics is. Anyone want to hazard a guess? When I say the word ethics, what do people think of? Shout it out. Don't be shy. Values? Good.
They're applied values.
Applied values. And if I ask you what values are, shit. No, I can't just define things by other terms anymore. It gets complicated. So, as a philosophical tradition, ethics is the branch of philosophy that asks questions around action. How should we behave? And they ask questions around what a meaningful life looks like. What kind of life should we live? What kind of actions should we undertake? When we are doing ethics, we undertake a cognitive and a linguistic shift. We stop thinking about the world in descriptive terms. We stop just painting a picture of what's out there, and we move into a prescriptive or a normative mode where we start talking about should. As soon as you shift from could, what could we do, what would we do, to what should we do, that's when we're doing ethics. And when we're talking about data ethics, it kind of is presented as this new world, this new category of complexity. Most of the questions that you encounter to do with data ethics are not new. They are slightly more complicated because of the scale, because of the subject matter expertise, which is inaccessible to a number of people, and because there is an additional level of indeterminacy when we combine data with AI and machine learning. But the problems aren't especially new. So that's the first thing I want to say. I want to demystify data ethics as something that is a totally new frontier. There are new challenges in the same way as there are new challenges in stuff like genetic engineering, but there is also stuff that we can fall back on and use. And that's my job as a philosopher, is to try to identify some of those things to fall back on. So with that very general backdrop, I want to ask, when we talk about data ethics and making it real, one way to think about this, I want to ask you, real for whom? And when we think about that, how does that answer? So when I think about data ethics and making it real, there is a group of people who I spend a lot of time talking to and hearing from on Twitter who are going to have a particular view on what real data ethics looks like. And those are academics like me. These are other moral philosophers whose expertise is in the history of ethics. And for them, real data ethics is going to be an approach to data ethics that is actually grounded in the academic discipline of ethics. That is not just hand-wavy sentimentalism, that is not just compliance checklists where we've rubbed out the word compliance and we've put ethics in there instead, and doesn't just pretend that this is all quite simple. It also doesn't pretend that ethics is some kind of a noun or something that we can infuse into something and then it's done. Ethics is an activity. There is no such thing as kind of a process that then you take data and wave a wand and suddenly it's ethical forevermore. Because as you will all know, data is something that we use. It's something that is fused with a myriad of different activities, and those activities have a particular ethical character. So too does the process by which we talk about and think about the ways in which we might collect, store, and use data. So data ethics is actually going to become a process, and someone who sits there and says, well, we have ethical data, doesn't mean anything. It's like saying that you have ethical money. There's no content to it independent of its use. But there's a challenge here in talking about making data ethics real for academics, because academics don't agree on anything to do with what makes something ethical. So within the world of philosophical ethics, there are a number of competing and at times contradictory schools of thought to do with what makes an action right. And we only need to think about perhaps one of the most frequently talked about applications of both data and AI in terms of how it might be used in autonomous vehicles to answer this question. So how many people have heard people talking about how self-driving vehicles should operate in crash situations? Yeah, should it veer off and hit a pedestrian? Should it protect the occupants of the vehicle? Are there certain groups who shouldn't be targeted? There was a study that MIT did called The Moral Machine, where they surveyed millions of people for their answers. And they came back and said, well, the person who should always be targeted is criminals. Who should hit criminals? I'll come back to that because that's a significant point a little bit later on. So there are challenges in terms of making it real for academics in terms of the incompatibility of different ethical theories. There are challenges in terms of ethical pluralism in a society where we don't necessarily want to subscribe to one school of thought. So what does real data ethics look like in a competitive marketplace of ideas in terms of how we describe those things? Now, I set that up as a challenge. I think in some ways it's a false challenge, because as much as academics will disagree on points of nuance in terms of how a self-driving vehicle should crash, they are generally going to agree that turning self-driving vehicles into vigilante machines that are kind of meting out street justice, that's bad. So there's going to be consensus even within competition, and we can start with that consensus, and once we are equipped to navigate those points of consensus, then we will be prepared to deal with the points of incompatibility. But we distract ourselves by talking about incompatibility first. So this is the first thing that I want to say, is if you've heard, well, ethicists don't even agree on this stuff, so how the hell are we going to get anywhere? That might be a red herring. But that leads us to the second question. How do we make data ethics real for the practitioners? How do we make data ethics real for data scientists? And the kinds of things they're going to be looking for are not academic treatises. I imagine, and what I've been told, is that the things that they're interested are frameworks, decision-making frameworks. They're looking for practices that allow them to guarantee that they've taken into account all of the different stakeholders, that there isn't some kind of inadvertent use of the data that they haven't anticipated, or that they've opened the data, or that the data can be re-identified after they've de-identified it. These are the kinds of things that they're looking for, are the kinds of things that will give them pride in their work, confidence that you can navigate ambiguity, and the kind of competence to be able to deal with the ethical issues that you might encounter, and then to be able to defend those decisions if someone were to challenge them. Because part of the exercise of ethics is about decision guidance, but part of it is also about then being able to defend and justify those decisions. So when you make a trade-off between two particular values, how do you defend that if one of those stakeholder groups challenges you on that? And the focus within the data ethics movement at the moment has been to provide you with resources. So how many people have come across data ethics frameworks, decision-making tools, stuff like that? So those things are all well and good, but like any framework or like any tool, it only matters as much as you care to use it. And if it just becomes another box-checking exercise or another PDF that you downloaded and opened for 5 minutes and now it sits on your phone until you need more storage and then you delete it, then it doesn't matter. And so the other thing that I'm interested in is what a tradition within ethics called virtue ethics is interested in, which is what are the character traits that define morally good, ethically competent professionals and humans. And I want to talk about 3 character traits that I think are really important to cultivate within the data ethics community. The first one is humility. And I think humility is really important because we keep talking about how data is power, how data is the new oil. And because the expertise that is necessary for data, because it is so prized by the marketplace, and because politicians have identified it as being so crucial, it can lead to a certain feeling of authority, both personal kind of authority, but also intellectual authority, that, well, I have the data and therefore I can solve the problem. So there's kind of personal humility, and then more important is what philosophers call intellectual or epistemic humility, acknowledging the limits of what you know, the limits of what the data can tell you, and not overreaching that. There was a case recently in somewhere where I used to live. There's a really steep, really curvy road that leads down to a main road from kind of a suburb. And about once a month, there's hairpin turns on this, and it's steep. It probably goes up at about a 60-degree angle at some points. And about every 2 months, they have to bring in a crane to pull out a bus or a truck or something like that. Because they've just followed the GPS down this road that wasn't suited to them. Now, yes, they should be looking at the road signs. Yes, they should be aware of what's around them. But there is also a problem there in that Google Maps is making a claim to be suitable to vehicles that it is actually not suitable to guide them across the roads. I think there's an issue of humility there in terms of the platform and what it is claiming to do versus what it is actually able to do. Right? The next goal that I want to talk about is self-restraint, or what philosophers used to talk about as temperance. And here I will defer to Jurassic Park when Jeff Goldblum's Ian Malcolm says, "You scientists were so preoccupied with wondering whether they could, they didn't stop to think if they should." Yep. Restraining yourself from all of the possibilities that are afforded to you by access to data and all of the things that you could possibly answer. I was talking with a bank recently, and they described the possibility they had this app that they were interested in understanding their users' spending behaviour as a better way of anticipating credit risk. They said, what if we also were able to track their emotional state in some way to better understand their behaviour? And they ran down this whole road of how they were doing this, and then someone said, I think we might be overreaching here. And I thought, do you think? So just because you can doesn't mean you should. The other thing that's going to afford particular value here is diversity, of course. You are not going to take ethical issues seriously if they are unlikely to affect you. So diversity is not just about kind of giving people from different backgrounds work. It's also about ensuring that we properly understand the full scope of issues, and so that the decision makers on our teams have some skin in the game in terms of the decisions that are being made. Now the final question, and I will wrap up because Matt's going to hit me otherwise. He won't actually, but is making data ethics real for society, for the community at large? What do we want data ethics for? What is the whole point of this project? Is it just about preventing missteps and minimizing harm? Well, yeah, that's going to be a really crucial piece of the puzzle. But what problems do we actually need data to solve? What things in society are too precious or too valuable to be reduced to a unit of data? And finally, what are the values that should govern our use of data? How important is privacy, and how should we trade it off against certainty or security or the accuracy of our data? What error costs are we comfortable with, and what error rates are we comfortable with, depending on the level of harm? 97% accuracy is excellent, but that means 3% of people are negatively affected by that. And depending on what the choice is, those error costs might be unsatisfactory. And thirdly, when there are errors and when there are harms, how are they distributed? And how does that correlate with other social disadvantages? These are some of the questions, the big picture questions that we can't address just by making sure that our data ethics process is compliant. They go to much larger philosophical, social and political questions. And I want to encourage you to see your work is situated within that debate. And I really look forward to your questions and talking to you during the Q&A. Thank you very much.